the walls that sing and bleed. They say Folsom is more than a prison, it's a living ghost. Every sound that echoes through those walls is either a song, a scream, or a secret the system tried to bury. When Folsom State Prison opened its gates in 1880, California was still building its identity, half frontier, half experiment in civilization. The gold rush had faded, but its aftermath remained: broken men, lawless towns, and a justice system eager to prove it could tame them all. Folsom became the answer, a stone fortress carved from gray granite, perched above the American River, surrounded by towering walls that rose like a monument to punishment. Inside those walls, the state stored its most violent, incorrigible, and unpredictable offenders. Unlike San Quentin, which carried a certain grim prestige, Folsom was pure containment. No pretense of reform, just control. Guards called it the end of the line. Inmates called it the last stop before hell. The legend of lockdown. From the beginning, Folsom was built for hard men and harder rules. Chain gangs carved stone, hauling rocks under a merciless sun. The clang of sledgehammers echoed across the valley, a rhythm that would one day inspire music history, but back then, it was the sound of survival. Early reports from the California Department of Corrections archives describe brutal conditions. Meals of cold beans and cornbread, punishments that included shackling, darkness confinement, and the hole, a damp underground cell where prisoners were left alone with their thoughts and their rats. Disease spread easily, violence spread faster. But it wasn't until nearly a century later, in 1968, that Folsom became a global name, not for murder, but for music. That year, country icon Johnny Cash performed inside the prison walls. His live album at Folsom Prison captured something raw, the sound of rebellion, regret, and redemption. The cheers of hardened inmates between verses echoed through radios across America. For a brief moment, the world saw prisoners not as monsters, but as men. Cash didn't just sing to them, he exposed them. And for the first time, the system flinched. The shadow of infamy. Yet even as music softened its image, Folsom remained a factory of fear. Over the decades, its cells housed some of California's most dangerous minds. Charles Manson, the cult leader whose family murdered actress Sharon Tate and others in 1969, was transferred through Folsom during his lifetime of incarceration. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, convicted of 13 murders across Southern California in the 1980s, spent part of his sentence under Folsom's high security. Others, less famous but equally feared, filled the tiers with coded conversations and carved alliances. A former warden, speaking to the Sacramento Bee in 2003, said, "Every generation of inmate tries to own Folsom. But Folsom always wins." Still, those generations were more than criminals, they were cultures. By the 1990s, the prison had become a battleground between some of California's most organized prison gangs, the Aryan Brotherhood, Nuestra Familia, the Mexican Mafia, and the Black Guerrilla Family. Each group ran its own network, its own code of honor, and its own invisible government. Violence wasn't random, it was policy. The unwritten laws. Inside Folsom, official rules came from the Department of Corrections. But the real law came from inside the tiers. If a man owed money, he paid or bled. If a new inmate entered without affiliation, both sides courted or threatened him. If a guard disrespected a shot caller, tension rippled through the entire yard within hours. According to California State Prison Intelligence Unit reports from the late 1990s, the facility became a microcosm of the state's gang wars. Inmates smuggled messages through legal mail, tattoos, or coded Bible verses. They communicated through mirrors and mop buckets, orchestrating attacks with military precision. A 2001 report noted that inmate-led organizations demonstrated hierarchical coordination rivaling street-level syndicates. In other words, the gangs had structure, money, and long memories. Even within isolation units, influence persisted. Guards found hand-drawn maps of the yard, lists of debts, and coded rosters of inmates marked by race and allegiance. The goal wasn't chaos. It was control. The 2010 incident. One of the most significant flashpoints came in 2010. According to official reports and coverage by the Los Angeles Times, a riot erupted in Folsom's Level 4 yard involving over 150 inmates. It began with a fight between members of rival Hispanic gangs and escalated in seconds. Guards fired warning shots. Sirens wailed. By the end, dozens were injured, and one inmate lay dead. The state blamed racial tension. Inmates blamed the system. A guard who spoke anonymously to the B said, "It was like someone flipped a switch." They all knew their part. After the riot, lockdowns stretched for months. Cell extractions increased. Mail was censored. Family visits were reduced. And beneath the surface, resentment brewed, not just among prisoners, but among the officers who walked those same corridors every day. The double-edged uniform. To outsiders, Folsom's guards are authority figures, but inside, they're survivors too. One former correctional officer, interviewed by The Guardian in 2015, described the job as living in the same cage, just with a key. He said, "You can't show fear. You can't show pity. You have to be stone, even when the screams sound human." According to the California Correctional Peace Officers Association, assaults on staff doubled between 2000 and 2010, mirroring statewide spikes in gang activity. Folsom was the epicenter, a place where the balance between control and collapse could shift overnight. Officers walked into work knowing every face in the yard remembered something: a confiscated letter, a denied privilege, a tone taken too sharply. Revenge here wasn't impulsive. It was procedural. The weight of history. By the mid-2010s, reform advocates began pushing back. Human rights groups, including Amnesty International and the Prison Law Office, cited Folsom in reports on overcrowding and use of force. California's prison population had ballooned beyond capacity, creating tinderbox conditions, and Folsom, with its 19th-century design, was struggling to contain a 21st-century crisis. Inmates spent up to 23 hours a day in cells designed for one but holding two. Temperatures in summer topped 100 degrees. Ventilation systems failed. The state promised modernization, but progress crawled. Meanwhile, gangs adapted faster than policy. Technology, smuggled phones, encrypted texts, became the new weapons. One intercepted message during a 2018 investigation revealed coordination between Folsom inmates and street-level associates across Los Angeles. According to prosecutors, it proved what officials feared: Folsom wasn't just housing crime, it was managing it. The song that never ended. Despite the darkness, Folsom still carries a strange legacy of voice. From Johnny Cash's 1968 performance to the modern prison podcasts recorded under supervision, it remains a place where silence and expression coexist uneasily. In 2020, a state initiative allowed limited arts and rehabilitation programs inside Folsom. A music instructor told the San Francisco Chronicle, "Every man here knows the walls can't forget. But when they play, even for 5 minutes, the walls stop talking." The irony isn't lost on anyone. The same prison that once echoed with Cash's guitar now holds the descendants of that performance, men trying to sing their way through confinement. But behind every note is the same tension. How do you find redemption in a place built for punishment? A legend reborn. Today, Folsom State Prison stands as a paradox, both historical landmark and ongoing battleground. Its walls have seen transformation, rebellion, murder, music, and survival. Generations of men have entered it as predators and left it as ghosts. From Manson's glare to Ramirez's silence, from riot smoke to guitar strings, Folsom's story isn't just about crime. It's about the line between power and humanity, and what happens when both are locked in the same cage. And as the sun sets behind its granite walls, that line still shifts, inch by inch, heartbeat by heartbeat. The blood code, gangs, power, and survival behind Folsom's walls. They say that in Folsom, loyalty isn't a choice, it's a sentence. Once you pick a side, you carry it for life. And inside these walls, sides are everything. The blueprint of control. By the 1970s, California's prison population was exploding. Overcrowding turned yards into pressure cookers, and Folsom became the crucible where gang politics refined themselves into science. According to the California Department of Corrections Gang Task Force reports, the first organized power structures inside Folsom emerged around race. The lines weren't drawn by prison officials, they were carved by survival. Four names came to define the unwritten law: the Aryan Brotherhood, the Mexican Mafia, Nuestra Familia, the Black Guerrilla Family. Each group represented more than identity, they represented economy, power, and influence. Folsom was their battlefield, but also their training ground. From this fortress, they would export their philosophies to every major California penitentiary, San Quentin, Pelican Bay, Corcoran, even beyond the state line. The gangs called it the program. To the outside world, it was just organized chaos. But to those inside, it was a system, brutal, efficient, and self-sustaining. The Mexican Mafia versus Nuestra Familia. The origins of this war go back decades. According to the 2001 California Department of Justice Gang History Report, the Mexican Mafia, La IM, was formed in the late 1950s at dual vocational institution. Its founders saw themselves as protectors of Southern California Latino inmates. They built discipline, respect, and unity through fear, a code that carried into Folsom by the 1970s. Then came Nuestra Familia, NF, the Northern California counterpart, born out of rebellion against La IM's domination. Both claimed to represent La Raza, the people, but in practice, they represented territories and power. Their war started over respect. It became about survival. By the time their members clashed inside Folsom, the rivalry had already spilled blood across San Quentin and Soledad. Here, behind the walls, the hatred became ritual. An officer who worked Folsom's B block during that era told the Sacramento Bee in 2005. You could feel it in the air. They didn't just hate each other, they trained for it. Inmates separated by race, language, and geography formed invisible boundaries. Even exercise yards were divided. A man stepping over the wrong painted line could trigger a riot. The Brotherhood in the shadows. Parallel to the Latino factions rose the Aryan Brotherhood, a white supremacist organization forged in the fires of prison racial conflict. The group began as protection for white inmates during the racial violence of the 1960s but quickly evolved into something darker, a paramilitary syndicate dealing in drugs, extortion, and murder for hire. Court filings from U.S. v. Mills, 1997, and U.S. v. Bingham, 2002, detail the Brotherhood's operations across multiple California prisons, including Folsom. Inside, their members used coded tattoos, shamrocks, lightning bolts, and the number 666 to mark loyalty. Their structure mirrored a military chain of command: generals, lieutenants, soldiers. According to FBI testimony, the Brotherhood held contracts on rival gang leaders and even on correctional staff accused of crossing them. One ex-member described Folsom as our headquarters in stone. To the administration, they were inmates. To themselves, they were an army. The Black Guerrilla Family, the ideologists. Amid the racial storm, a different kind of organization emerged, the Black Guerrilla Family, BGF. Founded in 1966 by George Jackson, a political activist and author of Soledad Brother, the BGF was rooted in ideology rather than race supremacy. It saw the prison system as an arm of oppression, a modern plantation. Folsom became a critical site for their message of resistance and unity. But ideology didn't shield them from violence. The state viewed the BGF as a radical threat, rival gangs saw them as competitors for influence. The result was war on all fronts, political and physical. Court and historical records describe multiple assassination attempts on BGF members at Folsom between the 1970s and 1980s. Every act of violence inside the prison rippled outward, influencing gang politics on California's streets. Codes and consequences. Every gang at Folsom operated under a strict internal constitution. Violations, snitching, theft, disrespect, or cowardice, were punished with death. The rules were written in secrecy but followed with religious devotion. Even those not affiliated understood them. Survival depended on knowing the codes. A former inmate told the Los Angeles Times in 2012. You could survive in Folsom without a gang, but you couldn't survive without respect. To enforce discipline, gangs held clandestine courts. A panel of senior members decided a man's fate based on evidence, often rumor, sometimes truth. Once a verdict was reached, execution orders were passed through hidden notes called kites. A sharpened piece of metal, a toothbrush melted into a shank handle, those were the tools of enforcement. Death could come during shower time, exercise, or even mail call. It was quick, surgical, silent. And everyone understood why. The economy of fear. Behind every gang war was a business. Inside Folsom, money flowed through favors, drugs, contraband, gambling, and protection. Each faction ran its own economy. Cigarettes were once the standard currency, then stamps, then prepaid phone credits smuggled in through staff corruption. According to a 2016 FBI Prison Contraband Division report, Folsom's black market trade reached tens of thousands of dollars monthly, all controlled from inside cells smaller than a bathroom. The profits didn't stay in prison. Investigators traced money orders sent to outside accounts, funding gang activities in Los Angeles, Oakland, and even Las Vegas. Prison wasn't the end of their empire, it was its control room. A retired warden told The Guardian in 2020. Every lockdown we ordered, they adapted faster than policy. Folsom isn't a prison, it's a headquarters with fences. The blood riot. In 2010, when that massive riot tore through the yard, it wasn't spontaneous. According to internal DOC intelligence reports, it was premeditated retaliation, the culmination of months of coded messages between Nuestra Familia soldiers and La IM affiliates. What started as a small argument during yard exercise escalated into a full-scale battle. Prison-made weapons, metal rods, sharpened fence wire, broken broom handles, were drawn. Guards fired rubber bullets and tear gas. One officer described it as fighting fire in a gasoline storm. When the dust settled, one inmate lay dead, 35 were injured, and Folsom was locked down for 6 months. The event forced the state to acknowledge what it had long denied: supermax confinement alone couldn't kill organized crime. It only evolved it. The new age of control. In the years following the riot, technology became both weapon and shield. The prison introduced surveillance systems capable of tracking conversations through vibration sensors. Cell signal blockers were installed. But even these weren't foolproof. In 2018, a federal indictment revealed that Folsom inmates had been communicating with outside members using smuggled smartphones disguised as legal paperwork. They used encrypted messaging apps to coordinate drug trafficking routes and even to issue internal orders. According to prosecutors, some messages were written like military memos, time-stamped, ranked, and signed. The war for control had gone digital. And yet, amid this technological chess game, human nature remained the same. Loyalty. Power. Fear. The code of blood outlasted the fences. The prison that learned to adapt. By 2020, after over a century of evolution, Folsom was no longer the same beast it once was, but it hadn't lost its soul. It became a hybrid of old and new, a relic of the 19th century armed with 21st century surveillance. But the men inside were still human. Still governed by respect, rage, and survival. The gangs had shifted, reorganized, and fractured, but their essence, unity through violence, remained the same. Even under cameras, even in isolation, they found ways to exist. As one anonymous investigator told the Chronicle in 2021, "You can lock a man down. You can chain his body. But if he has loyalty, you can't cage that." That's Folsom's eternal truth. The walls may silence voices, but they can't stop the code from whispering. Riot season, when order collapsed at Folsom. They say every prison has a season. At Folsom, it's not summer or winter, it's riot season. And when it comes, nobody, not guards, not gangs, not even the warden, can stop it. The tension before the storm. Every major riot at Folsom begins the same way: silence. A tension so heavy it hums through the concrete. Inmates move slower. Guards grip their batons tighter. Conversations die mid-sentence. By late 2009, Folsom's overcrowding had reached a crisis. Designed for 2,400 inmates, the facility was housing nearly 4,000, a volatile mix of gang affiliates, lifers, and young men desperate for respect. Cells built for one held two. In some blocks, inmates slept inches from toilets, surrounded by graffiti that read, "Respect the yard, or bleed on it." Reports from the California Inspector General's office warned of unsustainable pressure between rival factions. Inside, everyone knew what that meant: a storm was coming. The first strike. January 10, 2010. It started during morning yard call, routine, predictable, quiet. Guards released roughly 150 inmates into the main exercise yard. Sunlight cut through cold fog as men stretched, jogged, and whispered in small circles. Nothing unusual. Then, at exactly 9:17 a.m., it erupted. According to Los Angeles Times coverage and DOC incident logs, the first punch landed near the north corner. Two men, both Latino, members of rival gangs long at war, La Im and Nuestra Familia. Within seconds, knives appeared. By 9:18, the entire yard was chaos. Prisoners sprinted from every corner, weapons drawn, shanks made from melted toothbrushes, sharpened steel bars, even makeshift spears. One guard later testified in court that it looked like a battlefield from another century. Gun towers sounded alarms. Warning shots cracked through the air. Tear gas blanketed the yard. The riot lasted 11 minutes. When it ended, 35 inmates were wounded, 1 lay dead, and 5 correctional officers were injured. Folsom was locked down indefinitely. The aftermath. In the days that followed, Folsom became a ghost town. Food trays were passed through slots. Cells remained sealed. Officers conducted round-the-clock searches, confiscating 78 weapons, dozens of gang-coded notes, and even one crude map of the yard, annotated with positions labeled North and South. The DOC called it a spontaneous gang confrontation. But according to internal intelligence later cited by the Sacramento Bee, it wasn't spontaneous at all. Intercepted communications between Nuestra Familia and street associates suggested the riot was retaliation for a stabbing weeks earlier at another facility, Pelican Bay. The order had traveled more than 300 miles, carried through coded letters and smuggled messages hidden in legal mail. Folsom wasn't reacting to chaos. It was obeying orders. The lockdown era. For 6 months, Folsom operated under near-total lockdown. Yard privileges were revoked. Mail was screened line by line. Showers came twice a week. Officers wore riot gear even during meal runs. A sergeant who served during the period told The Guardian years later. It wasn't a prison anymore. It was a battlefield in slow motion. The emotional toll was brutal. Officers worked 16-hour shifts under constant threat. Inmates began self-harming out of frustration. Psychological reports submitted to the California State Legislature in 2011 documented a sharp rise in anxiety disorders and violent outbursts among inmates in extended lockdown. To outside observers, the facility appeared under control. Inside, it was unraveling. The code of retaliation. In Folsom, revenge doesn't disappear, it just waits. When lockdowns ease, scores are settled quietly. Months after the 2010 riot, another incident shook Sea Yard. 2 inmates, 1 Black guerrilla family member, 1 Aryan Brotherhood affiliate, crossed paths near the laundry area. Security footage later reviewed by investigators showed one whisper something, the other nod. 5 minutes later, blood covered the floor. The Brotherhood claimed it was retaliation for a debt. The BGF said it was a message. That single act reignited tensions across racial lines. Administrators responded with segregation, integrated housing was abandoned. Racial divisions deepened. It was as if Folsom had rewound 40 years. Inside the command center. From the control tower above B Block, Folsom's command center looks like something out of a Cold War bunker, walls of monitors, radio chatter, flashing red alerts. Every movement is logged, every sound analyzed. But even with cameras in every corridor, the system couldn't see everything. According to a 2012 internal DOC audit obtained by the Chronicle, roughly 70% of violent incidents occurred in blind zones, showers, stairwells, or moments of transfer between units. The gangs knew this. They studied the patterns. Some officers privately called it shadow warfare. To outsiders, it was statistics. To those inside, it was life expectancy. The human collateral. Both sides bled, inmates and officers alike. By 2012, Folsom reported more than 150 staff assaults in a single year, one of the highest rates in California. Officers spoke of paranoia fatigue, a condition described in the University of California Correctional Health Study as chronic anxiety caused by sustained threat exposure. One former guard recounted to Vice News how he began sleeping in his uniform. You dream you're back inside. The smell, the sound. It follows you home. Inmates suffered their own version, hallucinations, insomnia, hypervigilance. They called it Folsom fever. Everyone inside was infected, one way or another. The unseen hands. For investigators, the most disturbing discovery wasn't the violence, it was the coordination. Gang communications continued despite every effort to cut them off. Phones were smuggled in through kitchen shipments, hidden in loaves of bread or inside hollowed-out law books. One 2013 FBI operation, codenamed Iron Fence, revealed that at least 3 Folsom inmates were directing street-level crimes in Los Angeles from behind bars. They weren't serving time, they were managing operations. Folsom wasn't isolating criminals. It was incubating leadership. The realization forced the California Department of Corrections to rethink its entire strategy. Supermax prisons like Pelican Bay were built to contain gang leaders, but the influence spread regardless. Folsom was proof that even granite walls couldn't stop a network built on loyalty and fear. When guards turn on guards. In 2014, internal fractures appeared among staff themselves. Rumors circulated about officers cooperating with gang members, trading favors, smuggling contraband, even passing messages. A small percentage, but enough to break trust. A whistleblower later testified in People v. Grant, 2015, that a handful of officers became compromised by money and intimidation. The department launched internal investigations, leading to multiple suspensions and 1 conviction. For many honest officers, it was the ultimate betrayal. They weren't just fighting inmates anymore, they were fighting corruption inside their own ranks. Once that line blurs, a senior guard said, "You can't tell who's in control, the state or the yard." The price of order. To the public, the 2010 riot became just another statistic, another episode in California's long battle with prison violence. But to those who lived it, the scars never healed. Officers left the force. Inmates were transferred or buried. Families grieved quietly, their stories swallowed by bureaucracy. In 2016, during a state inquiry into correctional reform, one veteran warden summarized the truth no one wanted to say out loud. "Every time we stop a riot, we just delay the next one. The system runs on cycles of fear." That's what Folsom teaches, that peace is temporary, and control is an illusion. Every handshake hides a history, every silence hides a plan. The season returns. By 2018, a new generation of inmates entered Folsom's gates, younger, more connected, more desperate for identity. The old gangs had splintered into factions. The new ones were hybrids, blending ideology, profit, and digital communication. Officers noticed familiar signs, coded graffiti, quiet alliances, sudden tension in the yard. A sergeant looked at a rookie and said, "You feel that? That's the air before the next riot." Because in Folsom, riot season never truly ends. It just waits for the right spark. And when it comes, it burns everything. The aftermath, redemption, reform, and the ghosts of Folsom. They say prisons never forget. Every fight, every scream, every drop of blood becomes part of the walls. And at Folsom, those walls whisper, even when the yard is quiet. The years after the fire. By 2020, the echoes of the 2010 riot had faded from headlines, but not from memory. The cells still carried the scars, burn marks on doors, graffiti coded in loyalty and hate. The administration called it rehabilitation through reform. The inmates called it the same story with new paperwork. California had entered a new era of correctional reform, driven by court rulings and public outcry over overcrowding and brutality. In 2011, the U.S. Supreme Court case Brown v. Plata declared the state's prison conditions unconstitutional, forcing California to reduce its inmate population. Folsom, a symbol of both tradition and tragedy, became a testing ground for change. But reforming a place like Folsom wasn't as simple as releasing inmates or repainting walls. The real challenge was undoing decades of fear. A new face of control. To meet federal mandates, Folsom introduced the step-down program, a gradual reintegration model where validated gang members could earn privileges through cooperation and behavioral change. The program required inmates to renounce gang ties, participate in therapy, and demonstrate prosocial behavior. On paper, it looked progressive. In practice, it was a gamble. One correctional counselor described it to the Sacramento Bee. "We're asking men who've lived by loyalty for 20 years to walk away, in a place where betrayal is a death sentence." Some took the risk. Others pretended. And a few disappeared into protective housing units, their lives hanging in the balance between reform and retribution. The California Department of Corrections hailed early successes: fewer riots, better staff relations, lower assault rates. But critics argued the numbers hid deeper issues: depression, distrust, and the quiet psychological cost of decades in survival mode. From chains to checklists. For the guards, reform brought its own transformation. Gone were the days of the iron fist. Training now emphasized communication, de-escalation, and mental health awareness. Officers were taught to see inmates not just as threats, but as cases, individuals with histories, diagnoses, and potential. It sounded noble, but to many veterans, it felt like betrayal. A sergeant with 20 years at Folsom told The Guardian. "They told us to treat killers like patients. I understand it, but I can't forget what I've seen." He wasn't alone. Turnover soared. The average career span for a correctional officer dropped below 8 years. The job that once promised stability now delivered burnout and moral confusion. Psychologists called it institutional PTSD, the blurring of empathy and fear until neither works. The rise of the reformers. While officers wrestled with new expectations, a small but determined group of inmates began reshaping Folsom from the inside. In 2016, the Arts in Corrections initiative returned, echoing Johnny Cash's legacy from half a century earlier. Inmates wrote songs, poetry, and memoirs about survival, regret, and redemption. One participant, identified in the program as M. Ortega, wrote, "They gave us paper instead of razors, and for once, I didn't bleed." The initiative was more than art, it was proof that change didn't always come from policy. Sometimes it came from permission. By 2019, a documentary team from PBS was granted access to film the program. Their footage captured men painting murals over gang graffiti, the same walls that once divided them. A mural near the chapel read, "Yesterday we fought to live. Today we live to forgive." For outsiders, it was inspiring. For insiders, it was fragile hope, one bad day away from collapse. The men who never left. Not everyone believed in redemption. Some men had simply been inside too long. Inmates serving life without parole called themselves the ghosts. They kept to themselves, working in maintenance, kitchen, or library jobs. One man, serving a double life sentence since 1982, told the Chronicle, "I've seen 4 riots, 5 wardens, and 6 different versions of reform. The names change, but the noise stays the same." For these men, reform wasn't about freedom, it was about dignity. To die in a clean cell, not a violent one. To be remembered as more than a number in a report. And for some, even that felt like asking too much. The unfinished revolution. In 2020, when COVID-19 hit California's prisons, Folsom became a flashpoint once again. The virus tore through the facility, infecting hundreds of inmates and staff within weeks. Isolation, once the state's tool of punishment, became its only defense. A warden later admitted to NPR, "We built a system for control, not compassion. And in a crisis, compassion is what we needed most." The pandemic exposed the fragility of the institution, how decades of distrust made cooperation nearly impossible. Inmates refused testing, fearing punishment. Guards resisted outside oversight, fearing exposure. By the time it was over, 2 lives were lost, and morale hit rock bottom. But from tragedy came an unlikely truth. When the virus locked everyone down, the walls stopped separating. For a brief, surreal moment, guards and inmates shared the same fear. The legacy of Folsom. Today, Folsom stands as both relic and reminder. Its stone walls, once symbols of authority, now feel like echoes from a different century. Tourists visit the historic East Gate. Musicians still record covers of Folsom prison blues. But behind the guided tours and the nostalgia lies the living facility, 2,000 men still serving time, still walking the same yard Johnny Cash once sang to. The California Department of Corrections calls Folsom a model of modern incarceration. Reform groups call it a museum of mistakes. And somewhere between those two truths lies reality. Because Folsom isn't just a prison. It's a reflection of everything America fears, forgives, and forgets about crime and punishment. The song still plays. Every few years, new inmates arrive, young, tattooed, defiant. And the veterans, the ghosts of older wars, pull them aside. They tell them the same lesson passed down through generations. you don't beat Folsom. You survive it. At night, when the yard is quiet and the wind cuts through the wire, you can almost hear it, that faint rhythm of chains and footsteps, blending with the distant hum of lights. Some call it machinery. Others swear it's music. Maybe Johnny Cash was right all along. You can lock a man's body, but you can't silence his soul. At Folsom, both are still singing, one in pain, the other in hope. This story is a dramatized adaptation inspired by real events. Some names, places, and details have been changed for privacy. White heavy checkmark sourcing and references. Brown v. Plata, U.S. Supreme Court, 2011. Sacramento Bee and San Francisco Chronicle Investigative Archives, 2016-2023. California Department of Corrections Step-Down Program Reports, 2012-2022. Arts and Corrections Initiative, California Arts Council, 2016-2021. NPR coverage of COVID-19 outbreaks in California prisons, 2020. The Guardian, PBS Frontline, and California legislative hearings on prison reform.